So let's dive in here. Frictional. Frictional, it's due to scarcity of information. It's just that it takes time to adjust. Things are sticky. Basically, it takes a while to match employers and employees. So this is typically short-term unemployment. And this is really, you can view this as due to transaction costs. So if I were to start looking for a different job right now, so say MSUB, instead of going online, MSUB had said, we are closing down and we are closing down for good. Well, okay. So I would start looking for work. And I like to think that I'm a capable individual with a reasonably strong CV and some good teaching evaluations, etc., and that I would be able to find another job. Now, maybe I'd be wrong. Maybe the economy and higher education would be in such a train wreck that I'd have to look in other industries, and maybe there it would take me a while. But I'm pretty confident I would be able to find a job, whether I'd be able to find another job that in a location that I enjoy and right, etc. But it would take a while. It would probably take 6 months, a year maybe longer for me to find a job in higher education. I might take a job somewhere else in the interim to tide me over. Of course, that would qualify me as unemployed. So when I moved back from Iraq, I quit my job in Iraq and moved back without a job because I discovered it was taking a long time, if it was ever going to happen, to find a job from Iraq. And I spent a year unemployed. Now, I'm pretty sure I wasn't categorized in the government statistics as unemployed because I never filed for unemployment. I was looking for work, but I, in effect, had money that I had saved during my time in Iraq, and I funded, in effect, sort of a year to look for a job. That would be frictional unemployment, possibly. Now, we could have a high rate of frictional unemployment because of a dynamic economy. In other words, we could have a situation where industries are adapting and changing and positions are being rendered obsolete, and it's dynamic, and so people aren't upset about this because they are confident that they're going to be able to find another job because the economy is dynamic. And so it turns out that this is another case where a high rate of unemployment might be a good thing. As opposed to, my suspicion is, the current situation, right? So you think about so I would argue that rolling your health insurance to get it from your employer has almost certainly reduced frictional unemployment, particularly in the current environment. People don't want to go look for another job, or if they look, they're not going to take another job, or they're not going to quit their current job until they get another one because they lose their health insurance along the way. And so I would argue that the inclusion or the tax benefits of including health insurance from your employer end up decreasing frictional unemployment, but that is almost certainly a bad thing because we get less reallocation of labor to higher valued uses. So that's frictional. Structural, on the other hand, is persistent and long-term. Now, what is long-term? That's a question. Oftentimes it's defined as 6 months, but basically, so that's where this comes in. Maybe it's a year. Some places it's 6 months. Some cases it's a year. It depends on who you're talking to. But the key thing here is that a substantial fraction of the unemployed have been unemployed for a long period of time. And not just that, but that this is a long-term trend. So if, for example, let's hope this isn't the case, but let's say the current COVID crisis lasts for the next year, we're going to have a high portion of the unemployed who have been unemployed for more than a year. But let's say after a year, we bounce back and everybody finds a job. That would then, while on the face it would look like we have some structural unemployment, it actually would have just been a blip. And so we need, in order for it to qualify structural, we need a substantial fraction to have been unemployed for a long period of time, and we need that to be a long-term trend. So here's some figures. U.S. unemployment in 2005 and 2010. So as a share, now this is percent of those who are unemployed. So clearly the green sections, the book is more or less saying, this is from the book obviously, the book is saying that the green sections are frictional unemployment. So less than 5 weeks, you would categorize as frictional unemployment. 5 to 14 weeks, categorize as frictional unemployment. 15 to 26 weeks, we're starting to cross that threshold into probably structural unemployment, although we need to know the long-term trend here. Now, if you look in 2010, a larger portion of the population might qualify as structurally unemployed. But that doesn't tell us that they are structurally unemployed. The other question would be, was 2010 and its figures a short-term blip? Or did that represent a systemic structural change or a change in the structure of the American economy and American employment? And I think while on the surface it looks like that is structural, it turns out if we dig into the data that was a relatively short-term increase in longer-term unemployment as a result of the financial crisis. Now, on the other hand, if the financial crisis significantly rearranged the American economy, it is possible that then qualified as structural, but I doubt it. So hopefully that makes sense of structural. Now, if we look here, here's some interesting pieces. So if we look at just the unemployment rates in Europe versus the United States, so maybe we just look at 2000 to 2004. Where would you rather be in the labor force? Well, turns out the United States unemployment rate is significantly lower than most of these other countries. Now, if you go back to 1980 to 1984, the US was not the lowest, but it was, Germany was lower. By 85 to 89, it was lower in the United States. Now, and then we get a jump. We don't actually get much of a jump in Germany, which is interesting because we actually go through unification in that period. Maybe that's the jump between 90 to 94 and 95 to 99. But the key here is we have really high rates of unemployment in Spain compared to the other places in the last chunk here, right? Spain is pretty much dramatically above the others. Now, so if you had to choose, I would argue you should choose the United States on this margin. There may be other things to care about. But if you're choosing among European countries, if you look at the 2000 to 2004 period, you probably would want to be in the labor force in France or Germany. However, let's fill in this next column here, the fraction of the unemployed who have been unemployed for more than 1 year. Well, now the picture changes. Now, first of all, it doesn't change in terms of the United States. I would still argue I would much rather be unemployed, or I would much rather be in the labor force in the United States. I have a much lower likelihood of being unemployed, and I have a much lower likelihood of being long-term unemployed. Now, it becomes more interesting when we look at Europe. So France and Germany had, in the 2000 to 2004 period, right, France had one of the lowest unemployment rates. However, and Spain had one of the highest unemployment rates. However, Spain had one of the lowest long-term unemployment rates, while Germany, one of the lower unemployment rate countries, had one of the highest long-term unemployment rate portions of its labor force. Again, this isn't telling us something definitive, but it's saying unemployment on its surface doesn't tell us very much. We would want to decompose it into what type of unemployment. Because again, frictional unemployment, not too worried about it. Structural unemployment, yeah, I'm a lot more worried about it. So these do differ across countries. Of course, we're going to come back to in a moment why these differences are the way they are. But the first thing here is to understand structural. So what causes structural? I told you we were going to come to this, and we actually are already here. So one thing is large economy-wide shocks, and not just large economy-wide shocks. Pretty much every country around the world is experiencing right now a large economy-wide shock. The question as to whether that causes structural will be, how long does it take for us to adapt to it? How long does it take for us to adjust? So the first one is just sometimes economies are fairly rigid. It takes a long time to adjust, and the world changes. So you think about what will happen. Think about what would happen in Saudi Arabia if the oil price stays where it is. Or think about what would happen. That probably won't change a lot, although it will start to eat into the government budget and will start to change some incentives for people. But if you think about what will happen in the Bakken if oil prices stay where they are, that's going to take a long time for that economy to adjust to. So that's one piece. And that one, honestly, the only real recourse we have and the way to address that would be to make our economy more dynamic. We don't have control over things like the oil price. We don't have control over things like a disease. However, we do have control over the institutions that we have in place that make our economy dynamic. Which of course brings us to labor regulations. You may remember the regulation of credit, labor, and business from looking at the Fraser Index. Turns out that if we have high unemployment benefits, we're going to typically have more structural unemployment. What does that mean and why? Well, let's motivate that by looking here at why the United States may have had such a low long-term unemployment rate. So in the United States, in your first year of unemployment, you receive typically about a third of your income is replaced by government funds. Now, that's better than nothing, but that's a pretty big hit. Whereas you look at France in your first year, 80% of your income is replaced. Where do you think you have a higher incentive to go out and look hard for a job? The United States or France? Clearly the United States. Now let's look at Europe. Where would you have the greater incentive? In Europe, France, Germany, or Spain? I'd argue that Spain, although the difference is relatively small. However, now let's go to your second and third year. In the United States, only 14% of your income is replaced, which means you're really looking, you have a strong incentive to go find yourself a job. It may not be the best job, but to find a job. On the other hand, if you're in Germany and roughly 3/4 of your income has been replaced, and I know many of us right now have too much free time on our hands, but hey, if I could get 3/4 of my income with no obligation to go to the office or to work or to record videos or to grade papers, I might take it. Now, I enjoy my job, so that I probably would be a tough call. But if I was just doing a job to collect my pay, that's looking pretty attractive. Whereas in Spain, it drops to 55%. That's a bigger hit. Now let's go to the fourth and fifth year. In Germany, it stays at 72%. In France, it drops a little bit. In Spain, it drops to 39%. And so hopefully this kind of illustrates why you have higher rates of unemployment, structural unemployment in Germany than you do in Spain. Now, I need to make a note here that those earlier figures on unemployment are collected based on government reports of who files for unemployment benefits. That is oftentimes categorically different than what the actual unemployment rate is. So as I mentioned, when I took the year looking for a job, I wasn't categorized as unemployed, but I was unemployed conceptually. And so this again is sort of that distinction I tried to raise with GDP of the difference between conceptual issues with the measure and then practical issues. It turns out typically the way unemployment is measured is by the people who file for unemployment. Some people who are unemployed conceptually don't file for unemployment. Some people who don't qualify as unemployed conceptually file for unemployment. So you could have, again, as I mentioned, with 3/4 of my income getting replaced in Germany, I might, lose my job and file for unemployment and not really look very hard and actually not be willing to take a job if somebody offered it to me at the prevailing market wage. And so I would be counted as unemployed even though conceptually I was not unemployed. So hopefully you understand that tension. So unemployment benefits have an impact here, right? Large economy-wide shocks, labor regulations like unemployment benefits, also minimum wages and unions. Now this shouldn't be a huge surprise. Minimum wages, hopefully you can stop for a moment and maybe draw up the impact of a minimum wage. I will stop this video and come back here. Maybe you take I would encourage you to take a few minutes and work through, turn the crank on the impact of a binding minimum wage. In other words, a wage above the market clearing price that is legally mandated. So I'll stop here. We'll come back and I'll show you the picture, but hopefully you will have worked through it on your own.